Where were you, Lauren?
We were just in the Bay Area visiting some pictures.
Cool.
Yeah, the weather was amazing.
Okay.
We're
Start.
we were like
Yeah.
and then half the time in
This.
we've got this one. Friends are in Toronto.
That's where you're from, right?
Yeah, I'm from Mill Valley. So
Yeah. Love that area.
That's just in the
There's
next
a
one.
good one. Okay. I think we'll just start with that part.
Okay, wait, sorry, let me just make sure they have ability to share screen. 2 seconds. I'll have panels to start video. Okay. All right, we're good. Let me know.
Andrew, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started.
Timer's not plugged in somewhere. No, we're good.
We have the live.
Yeah, the live stream's going.
We got an echo. Is everyone muted?
Yes.
Hello. Okay, I think we're good. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, we will start our meeting. This is the second working group meeting for the Environment and Climate Committee Electrification Policy Options Working Group. For our agenda today, we have a couple of public commenters, which we'll start with. We will review, we had a couple of additional stakeholder meetings last week, so we'll just review some of the key findings from that. And then we'll shift gears into the policy options discussion. As a reminder, we're hoping that this working group comes to close to a final recommendation today that you can propose to the full committee. So we want to leave the majority of our meeting for you guys to discuss and deliberate any proposed recommendations that you have. So we'll first go ahead and get started with public comments. And do you have the timer screen?
Yeah, the timer.
Okay, I'll
Yeah, do you want to start this?
Yeah. Okay. And then for anyone who is, we do have a number of attendees online. So for anyone who is attending online, if you would like to make a comment during the public comment, you can press the raise hand button on your Zoom screen. And then that will indicate to us that you'd like to make a comment. And then we will, after we get through the in-person commenters, we will call on you and give you the opportunity to speak. Okay, so we'll start with in-person. First, I have Mike. And for each of the comments, we have 2 minutes and we'll have a timer going. We'll have that timer going. So Mike, the little red, yellow, green thing is your timer. So once you get to how many seconds left, does it go to yellow?
30.
When you have 30 seconds left, it'll go to yellow, and then red means that your 2 minutes are up.
All right.
You may begin.
Did you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. I'd like to open by thanking the city of Bend for supporting this committee, and also especially extend my appreciation to the entire committee and to the committee chairman, Cassie. Did I say that right? Cassie?
Yes, yeah,
Casey.
thank you.
Lacey. Okay. My name is Mike Reed. I'm retired. I live in Bend. And at this stage of my life, it's important for me to spend my volunteer times in ways that help provide a stable world for my children and my grandchildren and future generations. My way of contributing is to really promote the environmental aspects, environmental awareness and environmental justice. As the old joke goes, it's not cool to talk about global warming. And Bend is really tied into the issue of global warming. We have a rich history of being an environmentally conscious community, and I'd like the committee to really reflect on that. We're blessed with having significant natural beauty around us. It drives our economy, it drives our tourism, it drives our hospitality. These are fundamental underpinnings of the city of Bend, supporting its revenue stream and the quality of life for its citizens. When I looked at the policy matrix associated with the wonderful work your committee has done, am I down to 15 seconds?
Yes.
The first is I'd like to add an addition to the to provide a environmental support grant writing support effort, and then I'll submit my other suggestions through online processes. But thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming.
All right, next up we have Nora.
Hello. You all heard from me at your last meeting, and sorry. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Nora. I'm here on behalf of 350 Deschutes. I can say that I think many of the things I'll talk about here may be consistent with the asks that Mike is emphasizing as well. You all have received virtually the policy recommendations that 350 Deschutes is making, so I'll keep this brief. As we face the undeniable impacts of climate change, record-breaking hurricanes, devastating floods like those recently seen in Spain, and wildfire seasons that grow longer and more catastrophic each year, the urgency for decisive action on electrification cannot be overstated. The time to act is now, and to be honest, now is already too late. In Bend, the stakes are higher than ever. Our community faces the highest fire risk in Oregon, which is already reshaping our lives, jeopardizing our local economy, and diminishing our quality of life. Bend residents are looking to this committee for bold leadership to protect us from the escalating impacts of climate change. The Bend Climate Action Plan calls for a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 and a 70% reduction by 2050. With Bend's rapid growth, these targets are simply unattainable with voluntary measures alone. We need mandatory enforceable policies to make these goals a reality. Continued weak policy on electrification is not just a delay, it's a grave injustice. Low-income and vulnerable communities bear the brunt of exposure to natural gas pollutants and are hit hardest by climate change impacts. Additionally, with Bend's commitment to affordable housing, continuing to allow gas infrastructure is a disservice to those most in need. Electric buildings save on construction and utility costs, making them both more affordable and healthier for residents. There's no logical or ethical reason to keep expanding gas infrastructure when electrification aligns perfectly with our affordable housing goals. The residents of Bend are demanding decisive climate action. We urge low NOx standards, using the public right-of-way to halt new gas infrastructure, and raising licensing fees to support a just transition. Thank you for your time.
Sure. Okay, and then next we have Lena.
Hello, my name is Lena Magofson, and I'm a resident, a homeowner, and a landlord of one single family unit here in Bend. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I'm here to urge the Environment and Climate Committee to recommend electrification policies to City Council that will make a substantial impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the City of Bend. By prioritizing resilient electrified infrastructure, Bend can take a stand for the health, safety, and sustainability of our city. And I'm asking you to implement mandatory as opposed to voluntary policy. I recommend setting a low NOx standard for all appliances, using public right-of-way to prevent new gas infrastructure, and raising licensing fees and directing these funds towards just transition that will support low-income and vulnerable households. Gas appliances in homes release harmful gases, including NOx, benzene, and formaldehyde, which negatively impact community health. Unfortunately, as someone who has recently had quotes to replace ailing natural gas furnace, I know making the switch to electric is costly. We need to equally disincentivize energy sources that go against our climate action plan while supporting and easing the burden for residents to electrify. I know the city is deeply committed to affordable housing, and electrification aligns with these goals. Moving away from gas not only reduces initial construction costs, but also cuts utility bills, saving residents money in the long term. It also accelerates the opportunity for residents to pursue additional renewable projects like solar. As a homeowner of a home heated by natural gas, I couldn't justify the cost of pursuing solar when one of my largest home energy sinks is my gas furnace. We need to provide as many ways as possible to help residents default into climate-forward options. We are already witnessing the devastating impacts of climate change, from hurricanes and floods to record-breaking wildfires that threaten lives, property, and our way of life. Bend is not immune to these risks, and every delay in adopting strong policies only increases the challenges and costs we'll face in the future. By moving decisively to electrify and reduce emissions, we can play our part in mitigating these impacts, protecting our community, and building a resilient, sustainable future. Thank you for considering these recommendations.
Thank you. Okay, we'll switch to our online participants. So as a reminder, if anyone is online and would like to make a comment, you can press the raise hand button on your Zoom screen. Right now I have 3 people with hands raised. So we'll start 4. So the order, 5. The order will go in as Brennan, Christy, Colin, Christy K, Colin, Christy M, and then Marilyn. So first up is Brennan. Sorry, hang on one second. I'm trying to give you the ability to unmute. I just like it usually, right? Can you do it? Maybe because I'm not host. Yeah, who are we? Brennan. Hey, Brennan, you should have the ability to use your microphone now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, y'all. My name is Brennan. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'm an organizer with the Energized Bend Coalition, and I'm speaking to you this morning as a volunteer with the Deschutes Youth Climate Coalition. I just wanted to remind the ECC first of the urgency of action that we need, and second, spell out what specific actions we feel the most effective to protect the health, affordability, and future of our community. We recognize and respect the fact that developing new policies, especially ones that are big and need to carry us from a extractive, polluting, and unsustainable reality today to a just, safe, and sustainable future, takes time and a lot of careful consideration. But we reject the idea that we can afford to have any long-term options. The ECC has the opportunity right now to set the bar as high as possible and recommends our City Council to start developing every meaningful option that is on the table today. The climate crisis isn't waiting for anyone, and we can't afford to wait any longer in taking bold action. This is one of the most complex and difficult problems that any government has had to address, but I think we are fortunate in having the resources, the authority, and the opportunity to start implementing solutions that are needed right now. So our coalition submitted a letter, and I just briefly want to spell out what our big 4 asks were in there. First is implementing a low NOx standards on all home appliances to improve our air quality and protect our health. Second is a prohibition of expanding gas infrastructure into any new public right-of-way. Third is enacting a revenue-raising policies to create a just transition fund for local residents of all income levels. And fourth is to commit to a policy that ensures the city does not subsidize any new fossil fuel projects. So thank you again for the opportunity to comment and for all of your hard work.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next up we have Christy K.
Hi there, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm speaking to you today as one of the leaders of the Energized Bend Coalition. Just wanted to urge the ECC to be bold in their recommendations because this climate problem is big and the time frame is urgent. We really think the City Council needs to hear clearly from the ECC that you all think that bold and urgent action is needed, both on short-term actions that the city can take right away and also on longer-term policy changes that might take more development, but nonetheless, we should commit to and identify. So just 2 key points I want to emphasize. One, we think the elimination of new fossil fuel infrastructure in the right-of-way is a powerful, effective, and legally defensible solution that should be added back onto the ECC's list of solutions that deserve further exploration and action. So just wanted to really urge you to pull that back. And then second, Our letter, which went to the ECC last week from the Energized Bend Coalition, also suggested another policy solution that was not originally in your matrix for consideration. It's number 4 in our letter, and it basically states that the city should eliminate any and all city-level subsidies or incentives for new construction that includes fossil fuels. These could be things like expedited permitting or access to tax increment financing or access to other special development supports from the city. It fundamentally makes no sense for the city to continue subsidizing new buildings that include fossil fuels, given that this kind of development works against our climate goals and will actually produce more greenhouse gases in the future instead of reducing the emissions. We just wanted to point out one example. On Friday, the 25th of October, the Oregon Public Utilities Commission ordered Northwest Natural to phase out its line extension allowances starting November 1st, 2024. So the phase out has already begun, and it needs to be completed by November 2027. This is a great example of government agency moving to eliminate subsidies for any construction that includes fossil fuels, and we urge the city of Bend to use its power to do the same thing. Eliminate any subsidies or incentives that you may currently be providing for buildings with fossil fuels. Thanks for your consideration. I'll send an email to the story about that PUC resolution to the email address for the ECC now. Thanks. Take care.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Colin.
Perfect. Cool. Hello, my name is Colin Vogel. I'm a resident of Bend, a chef at 900 Wall, and a student at the Culinary Institute here in Bend at the community college. Thank you for the opportunity for me to speak today. I'm here to strongly support electrification and the phasing out of gas appliances in the city of Bend. I urge the Environment and Climate Committee to recommend policies to the City Council that make a real impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Please prioritize mandatory rather than voluntary measures to bring about significant change. The policies I would like to see Bend adopt include low NOx appliance standards, stopping new gas infrastructure in the right of way, and also revenue raising mechanisms that would increase licensing fees by 10%, which would be directed towards the Just Transition Fund. As someone who works in the culinary field, I can attest to the effectiveness of electric appliances. Today's electric induction stoves, for example, offer rapid, precise heating and are at least as efficient, if not more so, than gas stoves. They provide consistent performance and have the added benefit of maintaining better indoor air quality. Electric appliances in other areas like water and space heating have also advanced significantly, offering reliable and cost-effective options that meet or exceed gas appliance standards. Electrifying does not mean compromising on quality. We are all witnessing the impacts of climate change from wildfires to extreme weather, and I urge you to speak with City Council on these issues. Thank you for considering these recommendations. I appreciate your time and attention.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Christy M.
Hi. Hi, I'm Christy. I'm an engagement organizer at OLCV, and on behalf of Oregon League of Conservation Voters and the Central Oregon Conservation Network Coalition, which represents 11 local organizations, we strongly support bold, urgent action to reduce fossil fuel use in Bend's buildings. We urge the city to accelerate clean energy initiatives, and we call on the ECC to encourage the city council to take as much policy action as possible and as quickly to cut emissions in our community. Yeah, so that's my quick statement, and thank you again for the opportunity to comment.
Okay, thank you. And then last we have Robert Jensen. Oh, okay.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name is Robert Jensen. I'm a resident of Bend. Currently work as an environmental consultant, and I was a former city planner in the city of Eureka, California. Thanks for allowing me to address the committee today. I'm here to urge the committee to take action in recommending electrification policies that will protect our community from the impacts of climate change. As you all know, there's great risk in not taking action. These dangers include drought, wildfires, and smoke that are already affecting Bend, and the impacts are only continue to grow. By prioritizing resilient electrified infrastructure, Bend can take a stand for the health, safety, and sustainability of our city. I strongly recommend adopting the following 3 policies to strengthen our community's resilience. The first, set a low NOx standard for all appliances. The second, to limit new gas infrastructure in the public right-of-way. We need to prevent additional reliance on fossil fuels, especially as dangerous projects like the GTN Express pipeline threaten our region. By refusing new gas infrastructure, we can avoid being locked into decades of fuel dependency. The third, by increasing licensees by 10% and directing these funds into a transition fund, we can transition to electric. I understand some of these policies may be opposed by industry, but our responsibility to the community outweighs the resistance of a few. By shifting away from fossil fuels, we're reducing the risk of our expensive, dangerous disruptions to our energy system and minimizing the gas infrastructure hazards, which can be vulnerable to leaks, explosions, and price volatility. Bend needs to prepare for the climate impacts that are already here as we are continued to be faced with wildfires and smoke and other climate impact changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then last we have Marilyn.
Hi, Marilyn Kennitzer. I'm a Bend resident. For the health of the planet and the health of our residents, I stand with 350deschutes.org's testimony and the testimony of the previous people who spoke here today to strongly encourage you to set mandatory standards for your electrification policy. Voluntary standards for new construction would be acceptable if there weren't a climate crisis, but there is a crisis. And I have already written you a letter and inputted that on Friday, but I want to emphasize something right here that no one has talked about. The major builders in Bend, Paolish and Hayden, won't let you change anything on their floor plans or even their houses, the location or anything else. And so you may not have the power to do this, but if you have any power to get the builders on board with electrification, that would be a big help in reducing our greenhouse gases, because I would assume all they have to do is call up their suppliers and say, send me electric appliances, not gas ones, but they are not willing to do that right now. Also, I have an induction stove and I love it, a cooktop. It's the best thing I've ever had. I also have solar panels. So I'm trying to get most of the way there, but thank you so much for all you're doing.
Okay, thank you. Well, that concludes our public comment. And we'll continue on with our meeting. One thing I forgot to mention in the agenda is that we do need to approve our meeting minutes from last week's meeting. Did everyone have an opportunity to review those, and are there any comments or proposed changes to the meeting minutes?
No changes.
And look at that. But I'll skim over. Sorry.
I had missed where this was. I was looking on upstairs, so.
Would you like a minute to review them? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we can just approve them at next week's meeting.
Okay.
So that'll give you guys time to read them.
Okay,
And then,
sorry.
because we can then approve last week's meeting and this week's meeting at
Yeah.
the full committee meeting.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, well, let me move on then to first, just a reminder of our committee charge. The goal for today, again, is to develop recommendation to council regarding which policies to pursue as short-term action items and which to pursue as longer-term action items. So that'll be sort of how you should think about orienting your recommendation today, is those two pieces. And the other note, which we'll get to when we discuss, is that we do think it's important to prioritize among these things. You know, we're not going to be able to pursue all of them simultaneously. So as you sort of narrow down the recommendation, being able to help shape that prioritization for us. So for our stakeholder meetings last week, a few additional ones that we had since our last meeting were the 2 electric utilities and then one with a group of environmental advocacy organizations. We had really, really good discussions with all of them. For the 2 electric utilities, for both of them, a lot of the discussion was around the constraints on the electrical grid right now and how there's both local constraints and regional constraints, and the solutions and sort of the costliness of those solutions, and just the way that they're addressing those constraints is sort of different because for each of them, because one's an investor-owned utility and one's a cooperative utility. So a lot of the discussion was just sort of digging into how that works for each of them. I think the key takeaway was that the constraints, both local and regional, are planned to be addressed from both of those utilities over the next decade or two. The local constraints for Pacific Power particularly, they have a lot of planned upgrades to substations within the next 8 to 10 years, and then some regional big transmission projects that will improve regional capacity in about 10 years. CEC for local constraints, they didn't have quite as much of like a mapped out, here are the upgrades and this is when they're happening, like Pacific Power does. But they were sharing that they do have local constraints and they sort of tackle those on a one-off basis as far as bringing those, upgrading them so that they have the capacity. So, and then they also have a different sort of longer term transmission line that should be built in about 8 to 10 years also, that will help solve some of the regional constraints because regionally they are very constrained. So anyway, so no concrete takeaways other than there are real constraints. They will be addressed, but essentially that both need time in order to make sure that the electrical grid can support the increased amount of electrical demand. We talked a lot about how the pressure sort of increasing the electricity demand is far beyond just heating, electrification in homes and buildings in Bend. It's a lot on new data centers and AI centers, EV charging, just bigger buildings in Bend. And so there's just a lot that they're trying to balance right now, as well as occasionally a larger regulatory environment, which shifts and is not always stable. So they were just sharing those as some of the challenges that they have. So that was what the biggest discussion was amongst both of them. Pacific Power, we asked about, you know, their plan to, and the feasibility of meeting the Oregon clean energy targets. They said that they feel that they are feasible. They are planning for those. One interesting takeaway from Central Electric Cooperative is that they have sort of different tiers of power that they acquire. And in the tier of power, any new power demand comes from what they call tier 2 power. Those have higher costs than tier 1 power. So any new electricity demand that comes onto their system is at a higher cost, which gets then subsidized against all rates. So they just had some concerns around increasing costs and just how the more electricity that comes on, just because of the structure of how they purchase power, it does sort of inevitably increase the costs. So they wanted that to be something that we are just aware of and take into account. And then we talked a lot with them about making sure that the city is partnering with organizations that are doing this kind of work and other energy efficiency work. Central Electric Co-op has good energy efficiency programs where they're going into homes and making energy efficiency upgrades, including sometimes switching them to high efficiency heat pumps. The Energy Trust does a lot of that work. So a lot of our discussion was just kind of mapping out what's out there already and how we can fit in. So those were the key takeaways from the electric utilities. And then we also met with a group of environmental.
Can I ask on those a little, in terms of constraints, Do you think they are arguing it's fundamentally total supply, or is it transmission capacity that they're concerned with? And how well do you think they have an understanding of the overall supply mix that's coming online? And I ask this because our company is just getting overloaded with economic studies we have to do for all these huge new solar and storage projects
Yeah.
across central and eastern Oregon. Like they're just so many big new solar developments underway that are all outsizing anything else that's been done in the state before. So there's like a massive amount of solar being privately developed, and there are these PR campaigns tied to them, even just to make sure that there's plenty of support for these, because there are potential trade-offs, and a lot of it is tied with sort of transition for ag lands that don't have enough water anymore. I guess I don't know if like part of the implication is that we're supposed to consider not being too ambitious because there won't be enough electricity if there's a real dramatic shift, or that we need to shift more of our effort towards local generation, like more local solar or things like that. I'm just kind of wondering how comprehensive, how confident they felt like they knew like we know there's all these things in the pipeline, but we're not really going to be able to have them connected to the grid for us for a decade.
At risk of like being like a little bit over what I am qualified to comment on, I think with respect to like the message was that there are constraint challenges at like all levels of the system, like local and regionally, and that they'll address all of them. And I think that there's just, with respect to the things you share, there's just a high amount of uncertainty. The one thing I got is that they seem to all feel confident that we could meet an increased electrical demand with clean energy, because that was sort of my question, is like, if we have way more electricity needs, does that make it harder? Is that going to put us on more reliance on less clean electricity sources? And they all felt confident that they could continue to sort of decarbonize the grid, but it's just that it's going to take them time. I mean, I think that the message was like, if we were to like make a dramatic switch and needed something to happen within the next year, the constraints would be really real. If we have a little bit more of like a longer term gradual transition, those things, it all seems doable, but there's uncertainty because they just often don't really know until they're actually at the point where they're procuring the power and like where the cost comes in and what's available. When we were talking with Pacific Power, they were talking to us about their integrated resource planning process, which is where they map out these are the energy sources that we're going to procure for the next period of time. And they have what's in the IRP, but they say that that does not always match with, then they go try to procure the power and they issue these big RFPs and they try to match as close to what they said in the IRP, but they figure it's at the point when they issue those IRPs and then they hear what's available on the private market for them to procure. So they sort of have to like figure it out as they go. So I think, I think that there's opportunity, but everything just takes time to get it all there. And then within that time period, it's sort of like things can change dramatically. But they felt confident about moving forward, but were supportive of more of a gradual approach just to help them have the time to upgrade the system and sort of balance all of these things that are coming on at once.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I've been a part of a lot of these conversations in transportation electrification, and sometimes maybe the expectation of what quick versus slow is we're talking about different timescales. The like natural replacement of existing equipment is the existing primary user of electricity, and even with like a lot of growth, new construction is not it takes a long time to transition, even if we were aggressive. So I don't want aggressive to make the assumption that tomorrow our electricity demand is going to explode.
Yeah.
Because right now, from my understanding of the Oregon electrical system and grid, is that growth is not happening in the building sector. That growth is happening in industrial and AI, looking at reports that DOE has done. And so I don't want to conflate those two things.
No, thank you.
And I think, I think sometimes that often gets used in the utility world as well, where they know that when you look at the numbers, there's an opportunity to shift some blame from big revenue generators for the utility and opportunities to, substantially have big public benefit, that those two things get conflated at the same time.
Yeah.
I did want to ask about the total load growth versus like when or how that is coming online. I know CEC, a lot of that has to do with when the demand is happening, and in a more renewables world. Like, did they talk at all about demand response or anything like that to try to shift the loads of electrical loads?
That didn't come
Okay.
up. Yeah.
So just as a general comment, in the idea of how electrification fits into a changing energy world, intermittent resources like solar and wind work better when you have loads that can be shifted to match when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, general big picture wise. The way that can work out and you can set up a system to work horribly, where every load comes on at the worst time possible. But building out those systems, which I know that Pacific Power is working on, and CEC and BPA utilities are in kind of a little bit of a different boat, but trying to shape that load to come on when they have resources available that are the lowest cost and the lowest carbon is definitely something that they're working on doing as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and then with our environmental advocacy group, a lot of what we talked about are the things that you heard from the public commenters today. Several of the people that spoke were part of that group. So talked a lot about emphasizing, in addition to just emissions reduction, making sure that we're thinking about the co-benefits of electrification. We talked a lot about making sure that we're considering the risks of inaction as heavily as we're considering other kinds of risks. And just a note on, a lot of our meetings focused on sort of the legal risks, and they were trying to highlight that there's risks to doing nothing. There was an idea put forward to set a voluntary but aspirational electrification goal to help us sort of have something to measure progress against. And then the highest priorities from that group that came up was, again, we heard, I think today in the public comments, creating the low NOx standards, a real interest in reconsidering the right-of-way restrictions, and then some of those, just the idea of creating a just transition fund and a revenue source that can fund investment in helping people transition to electrification. So those are the key takeaways from the stakeholder meetings. And then one more thing that I just want to make sure that we didn't get to last time, before we shift into the discussion, is the policy options. So we got through the fees. We didn't get to the building code bucket. So just to explain that one briefly, one of the buckets is that we have the option in Oregon. Cities don't set their own building code. There is a pathway where cities can request a local amendment to the building code to have something specific to their community. So that was proposed as an option that could be pursued in order to see if we can somehow encourage or require electrification through that. This is an option that we're trying to get a better understanding of, but the takeaway we've gotten from talking with our building code officials, as well as some other people who have experience pursuing this, is that there's a fairly low likelihood of success in actually getting granted a local amendment, just because the state building code process is difficult and they have a desire to keep uniformity in codes across the state. And so our understanding is that to be able to actually get an amendment, there's resistance to in various ways. And then the other part that would be tricky about this is that even if we were able to create a new building code, it would have to be compliant with the federal regulations. So like the state of Oregon created a statewide building code that was compliant with the EPCA, the federal regulation, that sort of governs a lot of this work. And that in and of itself is very difficult. So for us to do it locally, you would have to come up with an EPCA compliant building code and then also put it through this process to get a local amendment, which can take years as well with no assurance of success. And then if you want to make changes to that code, you have to go through that local amendment process again. So it's not very flexible. So it's potentially an option that we're going to dig into more, but the barriers seem quite high associated with that one. And then city-owned buildings, the city-owned buildings bucket, we don't need to talk about necessarily.
On the building code, again, was this something that we could also be advocating at the state level? That if it was a change at the state level, it's potentially more efficient than trying to get an exception to state code?
Well, that was one of like just the, I think the very first statewide advocacy one was just like advocating to the state for changes to the building code. So at the state level, they could change the building code to do that. So that is an area that we could advocate in.
I guess I can't remember if we felt like we covered fully that issue of what is a more, it doesn't sound very efficient at the local level anyways, but is it clearly, like, if that category, if building code is something we cared about, is it clear that state level advocacy is more efficient than local in any way, or is that it's too ambiguous for that?
I think in this case, like if the advocacy was successful, that's a much more efficient way to get at the building code. The inefficiency with advocacy is just that you don't have a lot of control. You know, you can spend resources and then we don't have direct control over whether, you know, you see success from that or not. But if it was successful, a state level change to the building code would be better.
I guess I'm wondering, what policy is that? Is there a board making a decision about that, or who precisely at the state level makes the decision? What does state level advocacy look like?
It's something we would have to do. I don't know exactly right now. We'd have to dig into that a little bit more. Yeah. What's the name of the
Building
department?
codes division.
Yeah, and they're part of, okay.
So it's not a legislative action, it's an administrative action by a appointed board of some sort, probably.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like us to move into discussion.
Can I just say what, like, one sentence? I think in the advocacy bucket, when we had talked about legislative and regulatory being two areas, I think if we did go down that path of making that broad recommendation, I think regulatory could include building codes and utility regulations or something like that if we wanted to specify.
Okay.
Okay, so we had you all respond to a survey to just get an initial framing of prioritization of both short-term actions and long-term actions. So in the short term, education and outreach programs were seen as a higher priority than statewide advocacy. And then for the long-term prioritization, the order was regulations first, and then incentives, then fees, and then pursue the local amendment to the building code as the lowest of that group. So I'll just leave that there for you guys to consider. Since there were only, I will say, since there's only 4 of you, like they were all pretty similar, your responses. And I think there's a lot of nuance to like how you order these things and where they fall in your prioritization versus like sequencing. So, but that just can give us a little bit of framework to start with. But now I'd like to turn it over to you all to just hear where you're at, with respect to what you think should be recommended to the council and what you'd like to take to the committee to discuss further. Does anyone have just thoughts they'd like to start with?
It's always hard to jump in when you're online. So Andrew, just first opportunity if you have anything you want to start the conversation with.
Sure. I guess just looking again at the I've lost Cassie's screen here. I think, you know, I hear, just as like a general comment, I hear a lot of urgency on the side of the folks that have taken the time to come and comment. I think that's one thing that we kind of have to be clear about, is that as a committee, we're trying to recommend actionable solutions that we think have a strong chance of success. So I guess just generally some of the more difficult things, like pursuing a local amendment to the building code or fees, they're attractive in as much as it is an aggressive step toward, you know, moving ahead some of the climate goals that we've set forth. It's just a matter of how do we prioritize effort within the city that we think has a reasonable chance of success. And I don't know if that's been 100% clear to people. I think that what I see here in the prioritization results are the things that we kind of as a group over the last couple of days of talking about this stuff think are going to be impactful and also have a fairly good chance of moving ahead, given the constraints that we work through as a committee and sort of like the powers that are vested within the city to make change. So I agree with what we see here on the prioritization as far as what I think makes sense to encourage ourselves to put effort toward.
Great. I guess I'm happy to step in a little bit in that I feel like the top items in terms of education outreach, as well as regulation incentives fees, all could ideally be implemented in some consistent way that is sort of pursuing revenue generation and revenue neutrality while we're trying to internalize sort of inefficiencies in terms of accessing available funding that we aren't fully utilizing to sort of a full extent, and then thinking about how regulations and fees can potentially help to generate revenue that can then help to additionally develop funding sources for the incentives and the education outreach. I mean, I think that's something that we heard in the comments, which resonates with me, makes sense as well, like sort of where we can target most directly those actions that are within the realm of quasi legal feasibility while still avoiding any large new unfunded financial responsibilities for the city, or anything that might be seen as sort of a money grab, but rather more of a I don't know how much that concept of sort of internalizing externalities is something that is relatable or not, if that's too jargony, but sort of this idea of finding places where, you know, kind of like the natural gas line issue that we've talked about quite a bit, how we're sort of fixing things that are really not in let's say a good social interest in terms of how it's structured, and use that to also help address some of the costs that these actions will have, whether they're public or private costs. I don't know if that's helpful as much as
I
sort of
studied
thinking how they
environmental
connect.
economics, so I think I'm maybe not the most person to know something's relatable.
I guess my point is like trying to, if there is a way to think about these things not as completely separate, so that they aren't like a bunch of different challenges that have some cost requirements that are hard to sort out as well, and then others that are generating revenue that the public might think, well, what are they going to do with that money?
I
Just that kind of ask, just another question here. Go ahead.
No, you go, Andrew.
I was just going to ask how a lot of those things that Mark just mentioned, I think are addressed at least in theory by the Oregon Climate Protection Program that I know is under some level of revision right now. But when we talk about generating revenues for addressing these issues in underserved communities, I think that's potentially where it comes from. Does anybody else have any thoughts about kind of how that the Climate Protection Program dovetails with what we're doing here?
Yeah, I think there's assuming that it passes in similar form to where it's currently at, there's a significant component of that utilities will be investing in community climate investments, CCIs, as an alternative to, or in spaces where they're limited in how much emissions they can reduce. And so that is a potential funding stream for local investments. So potential opportunity there. I think that's what you're saying, maybe, Andrew?
I think, yeah, exactly. So in other words, instead of raising some revenue, I mean, the fees, for example, are difficult for a lot of reasons to get behind within the community. But if we're talking about, you know, where do those fees go and what is the ultimate purpose of that mechanism? I think I think we see that happening with the climate protection program rather than something that we're trying to implement here locally.
I would say I agree with this general order. Agree also with that these are not discrete things that we kind of need to think about how they pair and work together. And I think when we put together our kind of like, write up a recommendation, we can point to that. Yeah. But I generally kind of agree with this order.
Okay, I have a not necessarily a proposal, but this is the way that I'm thinking about it, maybe as a starting point. It's a proposal. So I think we've both shared, both in this experience and in earlier policy development with the ECC around the home energy score, the value or the limitation of voluntary action. And so with that and the kind of highlighting regulation as a priority or maybe something to go first. These are kind of some of the big picture things that I think are essentially our low-hanging fruit. I think for a number of reasons that we talked about in the last meeting, new construction in Bend is an area of regulation that I find particularly interesting for a number of reasons. One is serving it infrastructure-wise is the easiest when building new areas. The electrical infrastructure is built with the expectation of electrification, whether people ask for it or not, because that's the general trend things are going, and electric utilities aren't going to be caught flat-footed by providing 100 amp service to people that will be putting in heat pumps and electric cars, because that's the direction things are going. So they're already well served. It's the least cost opportunity to switch when you are starting from scratch. And also it's the most kind of present opportunity to set what realistically will not be a equipment change for the next 20 years unless required. At the moment of construction is the easiest time to do all of those things. I think this is different maybe than some other areas that we work, but I think new construction has, for a lot of those reasons, makes sense to be a focus. Also, with the growth that Bend is experiencing, we have a lot more new growth and new construction to focus on this, whereas some other communities that are considering this don't have new construction, or the new construction that they do have is really infill and not like greenfield new construction. So
I totally agree with all that. I think that all makes perfect sense. And I agree that sort of new versus retrofit is such an important thing. Does that all fall under local regulation, or do you see that as something that touches multiple of these? Does new construction, do you think, fall under multiple?
I think it could fit also under it also fits under education and fees. And incentives. And incentives. Like,
so does it touch all?
I guess
that's kind of if it's like a cross-cutting example.
Yeah.
Kind of wondering if it's sort of the example to show that these things need to work together.
Right.
Like sort of a case study cross-section.
Yeah. And so yeah, totally. It hits all of those things. And so these are just the buckets that make sense in my mind. It's like, this is an area that I think we need to address. And I think a lot of the potential solutions that we've talked about, in my mind, kind of go through a hierarchy of what I think would be the most effective, which is the direction I want to move forward in a recommendation. Recognizing that recommendation, that there's limitations to what is possible. And we've heard some of those legal limitations, but a lot of legal feedback that we've gotten has been like, this is going to take more work in phase 2. And so I'm kind of like taking that and saying, okay, recognizing that that's going to take work, we'll be involved in the process and how we can shape it to be as effective as we can and as like just and, like possible. That's kind of the direction that I was heading with this. So I think that's kind of the new construction bucket. In my mind, the most effective way of doing that and meeting all of those kind of co-benefits is limiting the amount of growth that can happen in new construction in the first place, which I think is most effectively done in limiting piping in the right of way. That's something that was brought up in the policy matrix as something that was not considered by the consultants, but recognizing that that's just an area that has at least been in conversation and considered by other communities, that I think is the most clear cut, has the most clear benefit. And so continuing to pursue that, in my mind, kind of seems like the easiest, or not the easiest, but the top in my book of like priority. And then if that's not possible, then I think the next space that still addresses new construction in an effective way is limiting new appliances in those buildings, and that would be furnaces and water heaters, new gas appliances. And that's using the Knox rule that we also had a lot of conversation about what is possible there and where those limitations are. And I think there's nuance in how that can be developed, whether that can be targeted or whether it can't be targeted, but whether that's new construction or all buildings, if there's a phase-in period to make something more appealing. There's a lot of policy tools in the development process that I'd really be, I think, interested in continuing with that. And then I think after those two steps, then the next most effective would be a pollution fee. So in my mind, that's the required, and then there's voluntary. That also could be a political decision that we're not making. If there was the political decision of we only want there to be, we don't want to limit, we don't want to tell people that they that we need to go electric, even though there's a big social benefit to that. A pollution fee could be a backstop to be able to internalize some of those externalities of building and new construction. So that's like kind of the bucket that I have in my mind for new construction. And then I think the other piece of this is recognizing that electrification can be hard, and we need to bring the community along with us in this. So I think it's been identified by the committee, it's been identified by the city that electrification has a lot of social benefit. It's the direction we need to go to meet climate goals. But it's hard and it's new relatively in the grand scheme of things. Heat pumps being really effective at cold temperatures, providing the comfort and the cost effectiveness has not always been the case, because before that we had electric resistance, which was kind of shitty. So we're in a new space with electrification. We need to bring everybody along with us. And so I think that's, in my mind, that's kind of the other category, is bringing everybody along. And so that can happen through commitments like we've already done with the City of Bend's buildings. That can happen with education, outreach, and navigation. So like trying to really help support people as they're figuring out what the right pathway to move forward with electrification is. And then also recognizing that it's hard to make these transitions. So providing incentives is one piece that we talked about at the last meeting. Having funds for a just transition to be able to support this work in low-income households or underserved households is another piece. And then the other, like, I guess, factor to consider in the education and outreach component is that we know that there are already some incentives that help support electrification with tax credits right now for electrification that I've been able to take advantage of. They're great. But there are more robust programs that will be coming online in January of 2026. So I think in our timeline and like how the city can support, I think that that's really an amazing goalpost to have out there to really try to help bring the community along and help as many people be ready for those incentives as possible. If they're ready for or only qualify for the tax credit now, that's great. But having that other kind of deadline out there of January 2026 is also a great target in the education outreach arena. So that was a lot, but it's what I'm throwing out.
I think that's great. And really focusing on new construction. And I think thinking about how we layer these things in to address retrofitting our existing buildings, since a lot of our buildings are existing, which could be achieved with something like a NOx standard at time of replacement. You know, maybe that's something that's phased in over time. It applies to new construction, but if, you know, at that time of failure, then appliances, new appliances need to be purchased with those standards, I think makes a lot of sense. And then there will be, you know, that's sort of a graduated period, and there's lots of time for education and outreach and working with our local trades on that kind of transition. I do think something in here kind of needs to address existing buildings in non-just voluntary upgrade way. So
that's
the NOx standard does that well. So anyway, I just want to think about that as we talk about potential items in here.
And that's a good example of, or we've seen other examples of that, that kind of phased in approach, and also like where it's possible, you know, kind of limitations. I know heat pump water heater regulations in California are doing that, where there are certain circumstances where that's not required, because like there is no product to replace a low boy water heater, for example, or some of those kind of components. But I think recognizing the opportunity, again, that's the next lowest hanging fruit from new construction, is at time of replacement. There's a huge opportunity there, and it doesn't happen very often because time of replacement is a like chaotic time. And so both from installer practicality, there's some opportunities to support, and there's a lot of partners that have been working on that in ways to kind of address and support the replacement market. And then the other low hanging fruit, and this is one where I think maybe a low NOx standard could address it, but it's another low hanging fruit opportunity, and one where I think as a region we have the opportunity to support the beneficial switch to electrification, is adding the desire to and need to add air conditioning in homes that haven't historically had that provided. That is an opportunity to, instead of just providing air conditioning, providing a heat pump to displace gas use or replace gas use in the winter season as well. So that's both, it's an opportunity because people need it. It's also an opportunity because people are ready to invest in it, not for a return like an efficiency measure, but so if they're already planning on investing to put in AC, the incremental cost of making that a heat pump is a much smaller thing to incentivize than the whole replacement, big picture wise. But I think there's maybe a little bit less opportunity to incentivize that at a city level. I haven't thought of as many citywide solutions to try to kind of accelerate the benefit of that natural opportunity.
I mean, having it come through the HVAC installers where they know exactly, and they are feeding you those incentives because they're benefiting directly, and it helps you use their services, certainly makes the most sense. And that's where it's been the easiest for us when we've done these sorts of things. But you know, I guess there's still sort of the question of where the funding comes from, and if we need to sort that out. Maybe that's all phase 2. Versus sort of the more regulatory approach on these things, which I think it still relates to what you were describing there. I don't know to what extent what you were just describing is a mix of incentive and regulation in your mind, or not fully settled yet. Like sort of that
for that last piece. I don't think I have a solution to what that is. I think there's an opportunity there. Just like there's a natural opportunity there, like an efficient opportunity in that decision-making timeline. But I think there are regulatory approaches, like big picture wise, that have been considered of like, you just can't sell an air conditioner unless it has a reversing valve to make it a heat pump. But that's not something that the city can do. That's like a much bigger decision, and I don't think that we have a pathway for that, but that's, I think, the regulatory opportunity there. And then the other is a really complicated set of overlapping incentives because efficiency programs typically don't support air conditioner installation in the first place because it's adding a load, but then that they didn't have it in the first place. But then if they do add an air conditioner, they want it to be as efficient as possible. And so typical efficiency programs and how they decide to make their programs, they get really confused in that situation. So there's also a missed opportunity there. And I'll also add one other piece kind of in the like low-hanging fruit or missed opportunity space is that there are replacements where heat pumps can be the most cost-effective option. They can provide the cooling where people are excited about that, but are not currently served by Energy Trust incentives because they're switching fuels. And so they might be kind of forced to stick with one system. So I know somebody that bought an old house, it had really awful leaky ducts and outside of the condition envelope, it was like, and the space was super easy to put in mini splits. But they were able to get incentives for replacing the gas furnace, but no incentives for anything that was a heat pump because of the fuel switch. And so I think that's the other area where there are existing efficiency programs, but they miss a certain subset of customers right now.
Can I ask a couple of clarifying questions just to make sure I'm tracking? So for Neil, for your proposal, you had talked about that other bucket of bringing everyone along.
Yeah.
And the things referenced in there, that's sort of more of the education and outreach, the navigation programs, even the work we've done to commit city facilities. All of those, I know you did sort of fold in incentives in there too, but it sort of sounded to me like those sort of sound like the short-term action items to me. Would that bucket, I guess I'm trying to figure out in terms of your recommendation, that other bucket, would those be pieces that we could recommend as short-term actions? Is there a role to be doing those things as short-term actions, which would mean that they would probably get executed sooner than the regulations just because there's so much more work to do on the regulations? Or do you see those as things that we should not be putting our efforts into until we get the regulation as a first choice or fee as a second choice, until we make better progress on that? How do you see those fitting together in terms of sequencing?
I think that there's a natural timeline for the education and outreach component with kind of impending money or impending opportunity of the January Homes HERA stuff. So I think that getting on that sooner makes sense. But in the incentives piece, there's part of incentives that is trying to maximize incentives that we know are already there or that we have coming
and
up.
we had bucketed
Right.
that as sort of the education and outreach,
In
just
the-
in
okay.
terms of functionally, like us not needing to develop one, but more direct people to.
So then the new incentives, I guess I think of incentives as incentives, and that includes new ones and existing ones, and the actions might be different for them. But the new incentives, I imagine would, we talked in the last meeting about needing to develop those regardless of the funding stream. And so I really don't know how that fits into the workflow and if that's the same people that are working on that are working on regulation, or where there's conflict and where there isn't. But yeah, so I don't know, maybe new regulations, if it's new regulations versus developing an incentive when we don't have a funding source for it, I think that it would probably be regulation, working on the regulation piece before that, but.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when I hear your recommendation in terms of how that fits into the recommendation for the council, which they want to know in terms of feeding into our work plans, is that we would pursue the outreach and education, including the navigation programs, which can help connect people to the incentives, sort of have a goal of having those things really stood up and well functional before the IRA incentives come out. And that's a big priority short term for the next biennium. And then the long-term priorities are, based on your proposal, are to try to figure out a regulatory approach that will work. Your preference was ideally the right of way first, and then Knox as well. But I thought I heard from you like a preference for the right of way if possible, and then looking at Knox. Or maybe it's just like, look at those two and figure out which of those is going to be the most likely. And then if not those, then pursue the fees. Does that sort of match what you were intending to put out there? I guess that's my first question, and then ask if people agree with that, or if there's changes to that.
Yeah, I guess framing wise, the hierarchy of regulation, I think each piece of those three, right of way restriction, Knox rule kind of, and the pollution fee all have they can all stand on their own. And I think you were right in saying that it's kind of we don't need to develop all of them at the same time. It's a waterfall, like that, or a choose your own adventure story. I think the top, we would want to do first, but if it's not possible, then we move to the next. And then if not possible, we move to the next. So that's kind of the general pathway for new construction. There might still be an opportunity for Knox in existing buildings that might need to be considered kind of forever or also. But I also think just this is for our recommendation in terms of the short-term versus long-term. I'm still struggling with that framing, and whether that framing is talking about when the outcome will be delivered as a whole versus like when are we doing work on it, because
well, I can clarify that, which is what I've shared, is that short-term are things that we can execute fully in the next biennium. Those are, and then long-term we will be working on in the next biennium, but the full execution is later because there's just a lot to figure out before then. And so sort of like the difference for me is like, if we tell the council, we're going to do outreach and education next biennium, we know for a fact we can do that. Like we can deliver something that's outreach and education. We can't say that for sure with a Knox regulation or a right-of-way regulation. We can say we'll work on it, but I don't want to, the long-term framing is to set the expectation that we don't believe we would have a Knox ordinance on the books within the next biennium. We have to sort of do this additional work, figure out what's possible, and then there would be like another step. Like basically we're not ready to take the final step on making that a reality. We're education and outreach and advocacy. We know we can just go ahead and do that. So I know it's like sort of confusing if you're not, it's more a little bit of our back end work planning, but yeah.
And I also just like in the framing of that, because I think the framing matters. I don't think that framing necessarily supports in a framing of calling it long-term, just like makes it seem like we're not doing things right away. And so I was, even though I know that there is work that's going to be happening in the short term on both of these areas, and it's not that we're asking we need to do everything tomorrow. It's recognizing that these things take time. They just take different amounts of time. And so that, that's
if you have, and we can call it something different if something feels better.
I think that's my biggest point on it is I think we should agree to what the priorities are, and they should be advanced as quickly as they can be. So like, that's basically 2.5. We don't think we can do something in 2.5 years. That feels like a very long time from now. Like, I think we should strive to get, strive to have one of these regulatory options set in the next 2.5 years. Like that would be a great goal. So I would love if that was a short-term option in my mind, if we're going to call it that, or figure out some way of setting some parameters around it. Because I think us as the committee, that's kind of that's what we're here to do is advance these things forward so that we're hitting our climate targets. And so I think we should think about, do we want to put some sort of timeline we think is appropriate around it? And then you all can figure out your work plan around that. But I think it's our goal to be making sure that we're advancing these things in a timely manner.
Well, I think then, like, if the short term, long term doesn't make sense from your recommendation perspective, you guys can just, you don't have to structure it that way. The council will ask us what this means in terms of work plans. So
Right.
like, I will probably continue to think about it in those terms, but if that doesn't make sense from your place of creating the recommendation and trying to set, like I hear that you guys don't want to set the expectation. Oh, it's fine if this is like long-term, which I think is, that's fair. So if that framing doesn't work for you, that's okay. The council just asked us for like, what are things that we can get done in the next biennium? So that's sort of where the short-term bucket came from. It wasn't really intended that everything else is a long-term bucket, but a way of differentiating, like what can we do within the next year? Like what can we say for sure? This is a concrete thing we're doing. They wanted those short-term things. So anyway, yeah, we don't have to talk about it that way if it doesn't feel helpful.
Why would that take so long? Why would like the Knox appliances thing take so
Well, I
long?
think we don't know how long it would take because there's just still so much to figure out. And so just the thought of like, we have to do more research, and then we're anticipating if we were in a place where we were going to create a regulation, we would need to have a much more involved public engagement process, and that typically takes a long time.
Is it a whole nother level of effort beyond some of these other that in my mind seem quasi-regulation like home energy score and even tree code types of things, and I guess it's not really regulation, but it feels like a similar level of effort, like the transportation utility fee, these sorts of things. All of those things felt like they happened within a year, like from start to finish. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well,
but
like the
other
tree
things
code
are-
was, I guess, a year, maybe it was over a year.
The tree code was quite different though, because we had models from we gathered multiple models from other cities who had done, there's many cities that have tree code regulations for decades. So we could start either of these. There's no city that we're aware of in the country that has a right-of-way regulation that prohibits the extensions for natural gas, right? We've looked, that hasn't, so we would be creating something, and there are many theories on which it could be challenged, so that would be an entire research project to try to forestall. And so there's the legal part. Knox, we talked to you about this last time. The only models are air pollution, are air districts. So for a city to do that, there are many things to think about. That's just the legal end. Then for process, I've been here however many years, I've been here 15, 16 years. I haven't seen us regulate housing and land use without forming committees so that we get input from the various affected stakeholders. Council could choose not to do that if council wanted to. I haven't seen that happen. And you generally want to create a record where you've reached out, especially if you're going to get challenged. It's harder for us to defend if we haven't created a record where we considered the various arguments, and that makes it better politically and legally to defend that if we have a record that we've created where we considered stakeholders. So that's the process that Cassie's talking about. Those are 3 months to a year. When we do big, I would say the home energy score was a much simpler. Again, we had models. We had 3 cities that had home energy.
I think the lack of a clear and
Yeah,
tested
that's
model is the hardest part. Like the home energy score, we had 3 other ordinances that they were all the exact same. We took that and made slight modifications to it.
Cities that tried to do the Berkeley approach, we tracked those. Those were months, sometimes years of process. And then when it unraveled, those were also months and years of process for those to be undone. We were tracking all of that as it happened because we knew it might have been coming in Bend. And if you were watching them in the cities, Eugene, there's Milwaukee, those were long processes to get there. Many, depending on whether it's in your development code or your municipal code, if it's in the development code, then that has to go to the planning commission. There's statutory citizen involvement. So they're just complicated processes, and you want to do it right. You want it to be, again, politically and legally defensible. So council, it will take your recommendation, and then their real first step is to decide what is the process to implement the recommendation. That's what Cassie's talking about. And then we have some new council members that will be coming in. So we're aware of that happening, and there'll be some new council members to educate on what do they think. And so that probably won't even happen until, February, March.
And the lack of the model too, like even on that process, that research phase, any number of things could come up that make it longer or maybe shorter. But because we've done some initial research, like our initial feeling based on that research is that there are all of these challenges that aren't immediately solvable. Like if there was something that we had done some research and it was like, yes, we feel like we could do this, then I think we'd feel more confident in being like, okay, a little bit more research, we'll map out a process, and then we'll be able to execute that process in a year. That's not where we're at based on the research that we've done. There's just some real just questions that are framed as concerns, but they're real questions that it's hard for us to even know exactly like what the next step is until we get clear on those questions. So the level of uncertainty is high with each of those, which I think then for me translate into a longer time.
No, that makes sense. And because I know the way we've got the matrix set up right now, we have policy options that aren't fully limited, but maybe it seems like the key issue is that all the local regulatory options seem to have no municipal precedent that we've identified. And have we already, I'm assuming that implicitly we've already looked to see if there are other local regulatory opportunities that Bend hasn't used yet that do have a precedent, and there just weren't any.
Yeah, that was sort of the, the root framing for this. And that's why we had the one column and like, where has this been tested or not? And the ones that were green were ones that had been tested. So like in the regulations one, like the benchmarking and energy performance standard, that's one that we would have more confidence around, probably still a pretty long process to figure out the right standards to set. And in terms of being sequencing off of the states may still be sort of long-term, but there's more, that one is more clear cut. So we put that one in the green and there are many other cities that have energy performance programs, like energy performance standard, building performance standards programs.
Does that fit into your scheme around new construction? So that we have some short-term, near-term local regulatory option that we're prioritizing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of that is the implementation of the state program, right? Like so if it needs to have a call out, then yes, I think the opportunity for Bend to go beyond those requirements, or like kind of find the right opportunity for Bend, because the legislative pathway allowed that opportunity for municipalities to do that. That's something that we're already a part of a coalition or a cohort to evaluate. But that also seems like, I don't know, squishy enough in terms of a timeline that it's like, we want to continue to do that. But I don't know how you would put a time goal on that, because we don't know unless
I know,
something different about
this
that.
one is a little bit different because in order to build a program above and beyond the state, you would just want to and perhaps need to wait for the state program to be in effect, and it goes into effect between 2027, 28, and even 29. So it's sort of something that just by nature of how it fits with the state's program, in order to go above and beyond, we would probably have to wait past that.
Okay.
Like, I think that one makes a lot of sense, but it's not as urgent.
Yeah.
This is like,
And the benchmarking piece is a requirement that's already coming down. And so that piece, which was an individual regulation in Portland, I think, or I'm pretty sure Portland already had that. A lot of big cities have benchmarking requirements. That alone has impact. Yeah.
So we have 20 minutes to bring us sort of, we have Neil's proposal is the one that's on the table. Does that does that framing and sort of order of priority, is that something that the rest of you agree with, or are there other things? Like, do you guys want to consider something different?
And I'll say, like, as a note, I think Lauren's comment about recognizing that the Knox rule has the opportunity to not just be for new construction, but also provides an opportunity for existing buildings in some way that is, you know,
Yep.
practical and supportive of time of replacement, was another piece that I didn't necessarily mention in my
Yeah.
first setup, but.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think if there's anything that we can do on the natural gas distribution system still, and I don't know if the franchise fee is sort of the most I guess efficient or low risk opportunity. I know that's been something kicking around for years, as long as I've been on the committee to do something with that. I can't remember how much we spoke about that last week, if we went into sort of the
raising
latest.
their right-of-way fee.
Yeah, because that's the one lever that doesn't feel terribly risky, right? But I don't know if there's sort of a threshold where we think it would actually have an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard part about like how much will it dissuade new natural gas specifically, but in terms of making that happen, it's a much easier process.
It does seem like pretty low effort. Is that
correct?
True?
Yeah, I mean, I think comparatively to limiting the ability for a franchisee or a licensee under our new code to build out their infrastructure in new areas, that is less risky and simpler. I'm not aware of any state caps on that. There are probably legal theories about what our cap might be. But remember that for the most part, those franchise fees are passed on to customers. So there's nothing in our code, in our new code, for example, that says that those fees have to be borne by the utility. So if we are raising that fee, I think there are some, this goes that phase 1, phase 2 process we were talking about with actually looking into, even if the actual council action of raising a fee is relatively simple, do we want to look at whether or not that has the intended effect? And it may, but it may not. I don't know. But to answer your question, comparatively, changing a fee is more simple and likely less risky.
It seems like if you want, it seems like if you wanted to have that disincentive effect, you would need to tie it into sort of education outreach and make it very clear to the public. And I don't know if there's a way to have it tied specific to new construction versus sort of existing connections. And there's probably no way to make sure that the utilities cost is transmitted to new construction. Yeah.
I know that question got asked. I feel like that question got asked at some point in one of these meetings, or maybe a meeting with council, on if there were any models for franchise fees to be different depending on any other justification.
The way our code is, all the codes that I looked at and
or licensing fee.
They're generally applicable. So I have not seen franchise fees that, do gross revenues differently, because the franchise fee is based on a gross revenue of the utility. That's based on gross revenues of only certain properties and not others. That would introduce potential legal challenge that wouldn't be there if you applied the fee generally.
And if anything, the utility has the incentive to shift it to the existing as much as possible, because they don't want to dissuade, they don't want to disincentivize new connections. So they would, if they're legally available, so that.
Yeah, I mean, the way we through our code, we charge a fee, but we're not in charge of how that fee gets paid.
Yep.
That's the way I put it.
You see it on your bill.
Yeah.
They just pass those on. All those franchise fees get passed on to the consumer. You'd be picking an arbitrary date, right? If you picked a date, you just kind of pick it for what new construction as of some date.
Right.
And then it would just go on and on, right? So it would definitely be a date that you just picked that we would then have to defend.
Does it feel like a pretty low? I mean, I think everything you're talking about makes a lot of sense. And this just, especially, I think there's a lot of public interest, a lot of community interest in doing something on the natural gas side. And, we've heard a lot about all of the regulatory challenges, and this feels like the lowest regulatory challenge of the natural gas levers that we have.
Yes.
Mhm. That we could show a signal, and hopefully it has some kind of effect, especially if we're communicating it.
Yeah.
And then could we allocate some of that fee into
The
an
revenue from it.
incentive pool of some kind?
I think we would want to, on the back end, look into what the limits are on either the entire fee or on the marginal addition of the fee.
Mhm.
I think there are questions there that would need to be answered in phase two, but it's probably not out of the question depending on how we did it. But we need to look at it.
It does feel like something we want to communicate very clearly, that we know this isn't the perfect tool, but it's our most legally defensible tool as far as our understanding currently.
Are you proposing, Mark, that moves higher up in the prioritization compared to what Neil proposed?
Not necessarily, but it still feels like low hanging fruit to some extent, like relatively low effort. I mean, I think the right of way stuff that you raised again and everyone keeps raising feels like something to keep our eye on as much as we can.
So I kind of look to you too. I think resource wise, we were talking about what phase two looks like and what the next year, 2 years, 3 years looks like. To throw resources at both NOx and piping in the right of way. Generally, not always, but generally, cities where there is the type of legal risk and the lack of precedent that there is here would pick one or the other. You wouldn't do both. For what I think are somewhat obvious reasons. We don't have the staff really to tackle both on the research, development, drafting, public process implementation, and then potentially defending. Defending two is more than defending one. I think if you all were interested in looking at regulations and not having to pick one or the other now, and keeping what you're calling the low hanging fruit, I probably wouldn't call it that, but keeping the franchise
lower.
franchise fee,
I say lower.
the franchise fee on the table. One idea might be to say, all right, let's call regulations either NOx or prohibiting some version of prohibiting new natural gas infrastructure in the right of way in new areas. So a lot of things that are undefined in that sentence.
Yeah.
And having phase two be the research process, which one makes more sense for Bend? So taking what was previously off the table, putting it back on, but acknowledging that in making the recommendation to ECC and eventually to council, that the next step in that process is doing some of the research that we're talking about to figure out which one we would do. Because I think what we're saying is we're not in a position yet to know which one is better. And that, again, broad word.
Right.
But maybe that's how to look at it, and then keep on the table the idea of a franchise fee increase if NOx ends up being the regulatory path that council chooses. I don't know. And so that we're, instead of eliminating one or the other at this stage, we're just committing to doing the research at the next stage.
Well, I mean, I think that's really helpful, and maybe the appliance does potentially target in the long run every building, every structure, whereas the right away is only going to be new in new areas. And if you want to prioritize, maybe there are a lot of reasons to prioritize that. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels about that. If you want to pick one or the other to have on the list, that maybe the appliances do make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in somewhat of an ambiguous in-between role. We had committee recommendation, we had community interest, we went to council. Council said, yes, staff and consultants, let's start this process. That all came back around with recommendations. Now we're being asked to make a recommendation back to council. And so in all of that process, we're not making the final decision. So what form our recommendation takes is, in my mind, a little bit up in the air of what's going to be the most useful. We can't give the perfect recommendation of every direction of staff, because that's also not our job. And so that was where my thought was, just to say, in terms of impact, we're not going to balance all of the priorities of the staff component, because that also feels kind of micromanagey. We're also not going to balance all of the legal risk, and and political risk. That all of those pieces all together is the council decision. And we're just making our recommendation of what we want to see, recognizing that there's challenges there. That was kind of where because I was like, I was all over the board of how many of those things to try to balance. So, yeah, so I don't know how you actually, take that. If you just, like you said, if you just spend all of your time developing the first one, or if you develop two at the same time, or all of that, I imagine some of that kind of comes down to, if this is our recommendation, like, what's the staff report that you're going to give to council hey, like, this is my understanding of where these things are, and where my legal recommendation is in regards to what the ECC recommended.
So I don't know if I can shed a bit of light on process. If the recommendation or the ask out of the ECC, which council adopts, is go do some research into these two potential regulations, call it right-of-way regulations or limited expansion and NOx. Staff will then spend more time doing research into both. It's going to take more time, more energy to figure out what the options are on both, and feasibility, risk, all of the things you just talked about.
Yeah.
Whereas if council says, we want to just do NOx, we're then not looking at the other one, and the research that we're doing might be faster or more targeted, one or the other.
Yeah.
It may be that research ends up being something that either isn't feasible, or is, we don't know what we're going to uncover. So you're right, it's a little ambiguous.
Yeah.
We don't know what the answer is going to be. But in terms of our process, if both are on the table, that's then more work in phase 2 to figure out and then report back.
Yeah. I also think
And
just
so it's a tough judgment call, but it is a bit of a judgment.
And I do think,
I-
Neil, like your analysis of just like, I don't think you guys need to worry about all of those other pieces very much. The most
Right.
important thing for the council from you guys right now is like, what do you want to see happen?
Yeah.
And then we will have a discussion with them about the work plan and the trade-offs, and what the council directs may factor those things in. But it's not necessarily your job to factor those things in. And you may want to take the strong position, I think it makes sense for you guys to just think about like, what in your perfect world, should we look at?
Yeah. And I think giving a prioritized list is different than, we think you should do all of these things. Whatever works, great, right? Like, this is our prioritized list. How that could mean, but by staff council or by staff opinion and council position, we don't want this on the table. Like, we're eliminating this decision because like council could make that decision, right? And then that changes. But if we just said, this is what we want to do, that's not prioritization. Because then if it was like, no, that's off the table, then it would be like, okay, well, then what are we doing next? So I personally like the idea of having a prioritized list in the regulatory world. I guess I haven't, and I also like the idea of how a franchise fee fits into this, and also fits into the funding of incentives and the development of incentives. And I guess where this is just like my literally back of the agenda framework, but where that fits into the recommendation, I would love to figure out how to add that into the framing, because I agree, it seems like an opportunity.
How much time do we have at the next ECC meeting on this? Do we just come with sort of a generally fleshed out set of options for the whole committee to talk through, and then after that committee conversation, we put something in writing that's going to go to the council?
Well,
I just had a quick comment, but go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrew.
How much of an opportunity are we going to have to explain to the council the sort of the context and the maybe a little bit more about the decision-making process behind the recommendations? I think what I've heard from the last few people is there's sort of a lot of nuance to kind of prioritizing these. but ultimately, I don't think we need to deliver that list to them in a vacuum. In other words, like, we're going to be able to say, here is the reasoning behind each one of these. And sort of now the next phase of the process is looking at it through the city councilor lens, which is much more broad.
Yep. Yeah, you'll definitely be able to share any amount of justification you would
Okay.
like. So at the next meeting, we do have the entire meeting allocated to it. So we'll have, and we don't even really have like, we should have pretty much the whole 2 hours for it. We need, the challenge is that we will not go back to the committee before we go to the council. So the direction from that committee needs to be certain enough that the committee needs to be able to vote on it without like checking in on it again, so sometimes we'll land in a place where we'll be like, oh yeah, and then figure out these last few things. It can't really be like that. It's going to have to be like, this is the recommendation. We're going to write up a letter that says basically that. And then that's what our chair and vice chair are going to have to go deliver. So in a perfect world, we have like a real proposal. It's just the sooner you can get to the real proposal,
I
the
hear
more
what you're
final it'll be at the end.
Yeah, I guess I'm basically, I'm kind of wondering exactly that. How much room do we have to bring the full committee into some of this consideration, or seems like we should at least have things quite narrowed by next Thursday.
I think since we only have 4 minutes, I still feel like the only, we have Neil's sort of concrete proposal. We have some additional thoughts that we've discussed regarding how the fee fits in, how Knox fits in. Is there anything that, and I think that that's something like, if that's the general framing of the proposal, that's something that Neil and Lauren and we can sort of work on in terms of preparing for presenting that to the full committee. So is there anything that we didn't talk about, or like anything that any of you like disagree with the framing that you want to make sure?
Does it fit well enough into the structures? I realize staff spent a lot of time on this, and I want to make sure that what we're doing is still generally consistent with progressing the staff work already.
I think it
feel
does, yeah, I
Okay.
do. And I know it's been like a winding road, in terms of where exactly we're going at the end of this phase. But I think that what you've laid out here, I think is helpful and moves us forward.
Is it the right level of ambition? Kind of like avoiding right away and Knox. Does this feel like the right scale of effort for the council to consider?
I think it does.
If at least how I wrote down, Neil, what you said, if someone said, do this, it's a lot. I think in moving the ball forward, narrowing from that larger framing that you have in front of you to something that could go to the ECC and then to council, I think it's the right next step.
Okay.
But I think if this were to be, go do all these things at once, that would be a lot for limited staff to do in a biennium if that was the entire work plan.
And there's still a phase
It moves
2
the
for
ball.
everything we're talking about. And then phase 2 gets narrowed.
Well, I think like initially we were like, if there's things we can take off the table, great. And if there's things we want to like prioritize among this option, that was sort of our original idea of where we got to. But I think based on the way the discussions evolved and just the large amount of information that still needs to be discovered to really take things off the table, I think where we're landing is just sort of the reality of where we're at, and it's just hard to get too much more specific.
Well, we're taking off local amendment to building code.
Yeah.
And we've accomplished city-owned building.
Yeah,
code.
exactly.
So
2 down.
that's 2 off of the list. That's pretty good.
But I think the way you framed it sort of sets out like a roadmap of prioritization. I think that in terms of like the magnitude and the workload, I think it is just, there will be discussion with the council on how we sequence and when and how frequently we bring these discussions to them. Because part of it is their own workload, honestly, like that can be a big limitation in the timelines for things is when we can schedule work sessions anyway. So that's the stuff you guys,
And
I think it
we
makes
could add
sense
some
for you to not worry
context
too much about.
in the letter too, around like why these decisions, and give them a framework for this and what matters moving, like what is a committee we think matters moving forward?
Yeah, I would probably encourage you in your report, and this is what Andrew was saying, the kind of backstory.
Yeah.
Like the prioritization that I'm hearing you say is like, one of our questions is, would you rather prioritize incentives and fees over regulation as big buckets? And what I'm hearing you say very clearly is no, we would rather prioritize regulation. And that's a good message for council to hear when it comes to your time, council's time, and staff's time. I would say, when we talk about regulation, I think you're hearing from the lawyers, we probably can't do two things, but keep the options open, because let's say Ashland does a NOx ordinance and it's challenged or not, that will give us a data point as time goes on. And we'll know whether that may or may not be a successful path. Some other city may do a right-of-way ordinance as this year or two unfolds. Like, if you take something off the table and we've chosen one, that gives us flexibility to achieve your regulatory objective. It's just too uncertain right now. It may still be uncertain in 2 years. We can't promise you it won't be, because Ashland was supposed to have something in front of them 2 months ago, and they did not. So everybody's taking longer than I think, but still give us more options to reach that objective, and that will be helpful for council to know at least your thinking.
And thank you for flagging that, Mary. Like, I think not that we've taken things off the table, but what we've definitely heard here is that we're gonna research the regulations, like what it doesn't sound like we're gonna do, at least in the next year, is sit down with our planners and development community and figure out development code incentives. That sounds like something that we would spend our resources doing after we do really try to pursue one of these regulatory options. And if after a period of time we've not made enough progress, then maybe we switch gears to saying, let's do heavy incentives.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's what
similar,
we're hearing from you.
Yeah.
and similarly, we're also not talking at all about any of the state level advocacy efforts, even though when you look at the matrix, that's where you get the most green. Like, if you're just looking at those columns, you would think that's where we should focus our effort, but we aren't. And so I don't know if there's sort of a check that staff doesn't feel like there's some really nice fits there that would like to go after those things necessarily that we're missing.
I think, I mean, I've described the advocacy opportunities before us. There's some level of us joining on to other advocacy efforts that we'll be able to do. So it's not like we won't be doing any in any form. But in terms of like significant advocacy pushes around something that we're specific on, we also haven't heard that, even in the short-term actions that came up as a lower priority. So we're not taking things off the table, but by anything being in a lower prioritization, then, the net impact there is that it's off the table for this year because we're doing the other things.
I think also we could frame a recommendation to have advocacy almost even in the form of commitments. Like, when we were talking about it at the last meeting, it was like, are we proposing that we want to start developing a coalition of people to push for a statewide legislative decision to limit gas, whatever that is? And we had said generally no, but I do think stepping in when opportunities present themselves, that level of like, if those opportunities present itself, we are committed enough that we're willing to be public about that support. I think that is not necessarily like a workload project. That's that fits in the commitments bucket, even though that wasn't, like how it was framed in here.
Yeah.
So I think we still could make a recommendation in that space. And I had kind of forgotten about that when I wrote this.
That would be nice to have that there, because I think several times just under the CCAP in general, we've had opportunities come up and say, well, it's not in our CCAP, so how does this fit in?
Yeah.
And so make sure it's still there.
Last point, let's say you do go forward with a recommendation also to increase the franchise fees. It might be helpful to discuss with the full ECC. I mean, that bucket of money is however much we could estimate what that might be across the city. If we regulate, there is always questions on, well, what do you do for lower income people that the cost of electrification, there's lots of studies on that in California right now and what that's doing to costs with electrification. So do you help people with those costs, or do you help with trying to get people who already now we want to be converting existing and the programs to convert to heat pumps for, like, how do we spend those funds? What is your recommendation for use of that increase in fee? Is it forward or is it current? Is it staffing? Like, what is your recommendation
Mhm,
to go along with everything else you're recommending? I
mhm.
haven't really heard a lot of clarity on that, and that might be helpful for council.
This
Okay.
last conversation is really helpful. I'm like thinking of all of these as like questions for us all to consider and maybe be some of the questions that we clarify with the committee. Yeah.
We're past time, so I think we're in a good spot. And then Neil and Lauren, when we do our meeting prep, we can sort of talk about how to frame this up for the committee meeting itself. And figure out, maybe define like what are the questions we want to ask the committee to sort of move this forward.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks
Great work.
everyone.